Chapter 1. The Island Grave. St. Croix, Danish West Indies, 1768. The fever was a furnace, and Alexander Hamilton was its fuel. He lay on a sweat-soaked mattress, the coarse linen scratching at his skin. The air in the small second-story room was a physical weight, a thick, sweet miasma of boiling sugar cane, fermented molasses, and the ever-present specter of death. It was the scent of St. Croix itself, an island that fattened purses in Europe and filled graves in its own red soil with equal efficiency. At 13, Alexander was already well acquainted with the island's brutal arithmetic. He knew which fevers killed in a day and which granted the mercy of a week. This one, the one that had laid his mother low and now held him in its grip, was of the latter kind. It gave a man time to contemplate his own ending. He turned his head, the effort sending a spike of pain through his skull. His mother, Rachel, lay on the adjacent bed. Her breathing was a ragged whisper, a thread of sound about to snap. Her fiery red hair, the color of a sunset, was matted and dark against the pale pillow. Days ago she had been the one tending to him, pressing cool rags to his forehead. Now she was a statue of herself, her face placid and waxy. He had seen that look before on the faces of sailors and slaves pulled from the harbor. He had survived. The fire in his own blood had receded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a terrifying clarity. He was an observer now, a helpless witness to the final act of the tragedy that was his mother's life. His father, James Hamilton, the fourth son of a Scottish laird, had vanished years ago, a ghost who had bequeathed him a noble name and a legacy of abandonment. He had chased phantom ventures and left behind debts and two sons branded with the one word from which there was no escape on an island like this: bastard. The thread of Rachel's breathing snapped. The silence that followed was louder than any storm. Alexander lay still, the world narrowing to the space between the two beds. There was no grand pronouncement, no final sigh, just an absence, a stillness. He felt a sudden, chilling cold spread through him, a cold the fever could not touch. He was alone, utterly. The door creaked open, and Peter Lytton, their landlord and a distant relation, peered in. His face, usually florid and cheerful, was a mask of grim duty. He looked from the still form of Rachel to the pale, wide-eyed boy. "She's gone, then," Lytton said. It wasn't a question. He entered, his heavy boots loud on the wooden floorboards, and gently closed Rachel's eyes. He placed a hand on Alexander's forehead. "The fever's broken in you, lad. A miracle." Alexander didn't feel miraculous. He felt hollowed out. He had fought the fever and won, but what was the prize? An orchestra of grief and terror was tuning itself in his chest. His older brother, James Jr., was apprenticed to a carpenter and lived elsewhere. His cousin, who had served as their guardian after their father left, had taken his own life a year prior, the pressure of his own failures too much to bear. Now, the final anchor to his world was gone. The days that followed were a blur of procedural cruelty. Lytton took him in, a kindness that felt like a cage. The Lytton house was larger, but Alexander was an object of pity in it, a stray taken in from the street. The true ignominy came a week later. He stood in the public square, the tropical sun beating down on his head, and watched his mother's life be dismantled piece by piece. Because Rachel had never been married to his father, the law viewed her possessions as forfeit. An auction was called to settle her minor debts. A portly magistrate with sweat stains under his arms droned on as their few belongings were held aloft for the town to inspect. A silver locket, a set of worn dresses, the mahogany bed where she had died. Alexander watched, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, the merchants, the sailors, the plantation wives, their faces a mixture of pity, curiosity, and contempt. He was the living evidence of Rachel Fawcett's scandalous life. Then the auctioneer held up a small, leather-bound crate. "A collection of books," he announced, 34 volumes, Plutarch, Montaigne, Pope. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Those were his. His mother, seeing the hunger in his mind, had traded and bargained for every one of them. They were his only real inheritance, the keys to a world beyond the cane fields and counting houses. They were his escape. He pushed forward. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, "those are mine." The magistrate glanced down at him, his expression one of weary impatience. "On what grounds, boy?" "They were my mother's," he stammered. "She gave them to me." A man from the crowd, John Kerwin, Rachel's former brother-in-law who had once had her imprisoned for leaving him, stepped forward. His face was a sneer. "The woman was a whore, and this is her obscene issue. He has no legal claim." The word struck Alexander with the force of a physical blow. Obscene. The magistrate rapped his gavel. "The boy has no standing. The sale will proceed." The books were sold for a pittance to a plantation owner who likely couldn't read them. As the crate was carried away, something inside Alexander broke. Grief curdled into a cold, hard rage. He would never be this powerless again. He would never let them take anything from him again. Let them call him a bastard. He would one day write his own name so large in the annals of history that they would choke on the word. His legal status was finalized in a stuffy probate court. The judge, barely looking at him, formally declared him and his brother obscene children and denied them any inheritance from their mother's family, instead awarding it to the very man who had publicly shamed him. The court, in its infinite mercy, did not cast him into the street. It made his guardianship under the Litton's official. Life became a series of ledgers. Not long after the auction, he was placed as a clerk at the import-export firm of Beekman and Kruger. The counting house was his sanctuary and his school. While other boys his age were out in the sun, he was hunched over desks of fragrant cedar, his quills scratching across pages that smelled of ink and money. He learned the language of trade, pounds, shillings, and pence, the market price of sugar in Amsterdam, the shipping routes to Boston, the cruel, meticulous accounting required to log a shipment of human cargo from Africa. He saw the world not as a map of nations, but as a web of credit, debt, and capital. And in the beautiful, ruthless logic of numbers, his chaotic mind found peace. He was good at it. More than good, he was a prodigy. Nicholas Kruger, his boss, a stern but fair man, saw it immediately. He began to give the boy more and more responsibility. But his real work began when the sun went down. In the small room Litton had given him, he would light a single tallow candle. He had begun to acquire new books, borrowing them, earning them. He devoured history, poetry, and philosophy. He read about the noble Greeks and Romans in Plutarch's Lives, men who shaped empires through intellect and will. He read Machiavelli and learned that power had its own dark grammar. He read and he wrote. He filled journals with observations, poems, and furious essays on morality and politics. The quill became an extension of his mind, a weapon to order his thoughts and sharpen his anger into elegant, incisive prose. One night, staring out his window at the sliver of moon hanging over the dark sea, the grief for his mother washed over him again, a sudden, unexpected tide. But this time it was different. The rage was still there, a hot coal in his gut, but it was now joined by a cold, clear ambition. This island was his mother's grave. He would not let it become his. He was a boy born of a scandal, in a place forgotten by the world, with no money and no name but the one his absent father had left for him to redeem. It was not enough. He would have to make his own. He would write his way out. Chapter 2. The Letter. St. Croix, August 1772. 4 years in the counting house had sharpened Alexander Hamilton into a fine instrument. The raw grief of his mother's death had been honed into a blade of relentless efficiency. At 17, he was no longer the boy who had watched his inheritance be sold. He was the trusted manager of Beekman and Kruger's St. Croix operations. His employer, Nicholas Kruger, had sailed for New York months ago, seeking a cure for some persistent ailment in a cooler climate. He left his entire enterprise, the ships, the warehouses, the complex calculus of debt and credit, in the hands of a teenage clerk with no family and no fortune. It was an act of faith that Alexander repaid with a devotion that bordered on obsession. He worked from before sunrise until long after the last candle on Christiansted's Main Street was snuffed out. He could calculate a ship captain's commission, dictate a stern letter to a debtor in Philadelphia, and placate a furious plantation owner in 3 different languages before breakfast. His mind was a fortress of facts and figures, a bulwark against the chaos that had defined his youth. The chaos, however, was about to return. It began with an unnatural quiet. On the last day of August, the perpetual trade winds that fanned the island simply ceased. The air grew heavy, thick, and suffocatingly hot. The sea, usually a riot of turquoise and white, became a flat, metallic sheet of gray. A strange, yellowish light bathed the island, making the vibrant greens of the palms look sickly. The dockworkers and slaves, who knew the moods of the sky better than any man, looked to the horizon with wide, fearful eyes and whispered the old words, "Huracan," hurricane. Alexander felt it in his bones. He dismissed the unease of his fellow clerks and began his preparations. He directed the men to reinforce the warehouse shutters, to haul the most valuable casks of rum and molasses to the highest ground, to secure the ledgers, the firm's paper sold, in oilskin sacks. They looked at him, a boy giving orders to men twice his age, with skepticism that soon turned to grudging respect as he worked alongside them, his slight frame wiry with a nervous energy that seemed to infect them all. The storm arrived just after nightfall. It did not come with the gradual build of a normal squall, but with the sudden violence of an ambush. The first gust of wind was a physical blow, a solid wall of air that tore shingles from the roofs and sent them spinning into the darkness like clay plates. Then came the rain, not in drops but in horizontal sheets that hit the walls of the counting house with the force of a fire hose. The world dissolved into a symphony of terror, the demonic shriek of the wind, the cannon-like boom of waves crashing over the sea wall, the splintering crack of ancient mahogany trees surrendering to the assault. Alexander, trapped in the main office, could only listen as the island was ripped apart. The building groaned around him, every nail and joint protesting the violence. He thought of the flimsy shacks in the slave quarters, of the ships in the harbor being smashed against the docks. He thought of the Lytton house, where he still kept a small room, and wondered if it still stood. The tempest raged for hours. It was a force beyond human comprehension, a display of nature's raw, untamable power. This was not the orderly world of his ledgers. This was the universe in a state of primal fury. For a boy who had dedicated his life to imposing order on a chaotic world, the experience was both terrifying and profoundly humbling. It was, he would later think, like seeing the face of God in his most wrathful aspect. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a shattered world in its wake. Alexander stepped outside into a landscape of apocalyptic ruin. Where a bustling port had been, there was now a junkyard of splintered masts and foundered hulls. The warehouses had been breached, the streets were choked with debris, and a strange, mournful silence had replaced the wind's scream. He walked through the wreckage, his boots sinking into the mud, his face a mask of shock. He saw families huddled in the ruins of their homes, their faces blank with disbelief. He saw a devastation more complete than any he could have imagined. The meticulous clerk in him took over first. He spent the next few days in a frenzy of activity, assessing the damage to Kruger's assets, organizing salvage crews, and dispatching emergency orders to secure what little remained. But beneath the surface of his methodical work, something else was stirring. He had been a witness to an event of biblical proportions, and the poet within him, the boy who had read Pope and dreamed of worlds beyond the horizon, demanded a voice. One evening, in his candle-lit room amidst the sounds of hammering as the town began to rebuild, he sat down not with a ledger, but with a clean sheet of paper. He felt an overwhelming urge to capture what he had seen, to give form to the sublime and terrifying emotions the hurricane had unleashed. He decided to frame it as a letter to his father, James Hamilton. It wasn't that he expected the man to ever read it. He hadn't seen him in years. The address was merely a vessel, a way to pour out his soul. His quill flew across the page, the words coming in a torrent. Honored Sir, I take up my pen just to give you an imperfect account of one of the most dreadful hurricanes that memory or any records would ever can trace. It began about dusk, and raged with such relentless fury that the whole frame of nature seemed to be convulsed. A great part of the buildings were leveled to the ground, the ships in the harbor were dashed to pieces. The roaring of the sea and wind, the prodigious glare of the perpetual lightning, the crash of falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into angels. Good God! What horror and destruction! It's impossible for me to describe it or for you to form any idea of it. It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. He wrote through the night, filling the page with vivid imagery and philosophical reflection. He was no longer just a clerk reporting on damages. He was a chronicler of a divine reckoning, a young man grappling with mortality, fate, and the terrifying power of his Creator. The next day, exhausted but possessed by a strange sense of catharsis, he showed the letter to the Reverend Hugh Knox. Knox was a Presbyterian minister, a mentor who had recognized the fire in Alexander's mind and had fed it with books from his own library. The minister read the letter, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finished, he looked up at Alexander, his eyes wide with an emotion the boy could not quite decipher. It was awe. Alexander, Knox said, his voice hushed. This is more than a letter. This is literature. This is a sermon. The people of this island, they need to read this. Before Alexander could protest, Knox had taken the letter. He made a fair copy and, without telling the boy, submitted it to the Royal Danish-American Gazette. A few days later, Alexander saw it. There, on the front page of the colony's main newspaper, was his letter, published anonymously. He read his own words, his private, anguished thoughts now laid bare for the entire island to see. He felt a flush of terror, of exposure. But as he walked through the town, he began to hear people talking about it. They spoke of the power of the language, how it perfectly captured the terror they had all felt. The letter gave voice to their collective trauma. The island's leading merchants, men who had previously seen him as nothing more than Kruger's clever clerk, now saw something else. They saw a mind of extraordinary power. At a meeting of the town elders, Hugh Knox revealed Alexander as the author. A plan began to form, whispered at first, then spoken with conviction. A mind like that did not belong on St. Croix, logging shipments of sugar. A mind like that belonged in the wider world where it could be properly educated. It was a force of nature in its own right, one that had to be unleashed. A collection was taken. The same men who had once watched his mother's possessions be auctioned off now reached into their pockets to fund his future. They were not just investing in a boy. They were exporting a hurricane, sending their brilliant, tempestuous son to the American colonies, certain that he was destined to make a thunderous impact on the world. Alexander stood on the deck of the ship bound for Boston, a purse of coins in his pocket, and a handful of introductory letters from Reverend Knox. He watched the green hills of St. Croix, the island that had been his cradle and his cage, shrink into the vastness of the Atlantic. The sea that had almost destroyed him was now his salvation. He was sailing toward an unknown future, armed with nothing but the hurricane inside him and a quill pen that had proven to be mightier than any storm. Chapter 3: The New World. New York City, 1773. New York was a city of controlled chaos, a symphony of ambition played in a dozen languages. After a brief, unsatisfying stint at a preparatory academy in New Jersey, Alexander had arrived in the colonial metropolis, a place that mirrored the restless energy thrumming in his own veins. The city was a world away from the languid, sun-drenched tyranny of St. Croix. Here the air was sharp with the tang of salt and coal smoke, and the streets were a churning river of humanity. Soberly dressed merchants, rough-hewn sailors with tar-stained hands, chattering shop girls, and everywhere the scarlet coats of British soldiers, a constant, prideful reminder of who was in charge. For Alexander, it was intoxicating and terrifying. He was an outsider in every sense. His skin was tanned a darker shade than that of the pale New Yorkers, a legacy of the Caribbean sun. His speech, though precise and articulate, carried the lilt of the islands, a subtle music that marked him as foreign, and most significantly, he was poor. The funds from his St. Croix patrons were enough for tuition and modest living, but not enough to erase the ever-present anxiety of a man with no family, no land, and no safety net. He was a tightrope walker, and the abyss of failure was a long way down. He enrolled at King's College, a modest institution nestled near the Hudson River. To the astonishment of his tutors, he consumed the curriculum with a ravenous hunger. He tore through Latin and Greek, devoured mathematics and anatomy, and challenged his professors on points of law and moral philosophy. He was not a student. He was an intellectual siege engine. He petitioned the college president to allow him to advance at his own pace, to study for multiple years of coursework simultaneously. The request was unprecedented, but his brilliance was undeniable, and it was granted. While his classmates slept or caroused in the city's taverns, Alexander sat in his small rented room, his world illuminated by a single candle, filling notebooks with meticulous notes and fiery, original thoughts. But the real education was happening outside the college walls. The city was a tinderbox and the sparks of rebellion were flying. The Tea Act, the latest in a series of perceived injustices from London, had inflamed the populace. Men gathered on street corners and in smoky pubs, their voices low and angry, speaking of liberty, rights, and tyranny. Alexander, the boy who had railed against the arbitrary power of a probate judge, found the rhetoric irresistible. This was not the abstract philosophy of his textbooks. This was the language of his own life, magnified to the scale of nations. He began attending public rallies, standing at the edge of the crowd, a silent, intense observer. He listened to the Sons of Liberty, men like Isaac Sears and Alexander MacDougall, as they whipped the crowds into a patriotic frenzy. He felt the raw power of their words, the way they could weave ideas into a weapon. He saw the tension in the faces of the British soldiers who watched these gatherings, their hands resting uneasily on their muskets. He had to choose a side. Loyalty to the crown meant stability, order, and the protection of the world's greatest military power, everything a man forged in chaos should have craved. But the crown also represented a system of inherited privilege and distant, unaccountable authority. It was the world that had declared him obscene and powerless. The revolution, on the other hand, was a gamble. It was a hurricane, promising to tear down the old world. But in the wreckage, a new one could be built, a world where a man was judged not by his birth, but by his talent and his will. For Alexander Hamilton, there was never really a choice. His own entry into the fray was unplanned, a sudden combustion of intellect and opportunity. On a sweltering July day in 1774, a massive crowd gathered in the fields, an open commons area near the college, to debate a response to the British blockade of Boston Harbor. The official speakers, prominent merchants and lawyers, urged caution and moderation. The crowd grew restless, hungry for fire. Alexander stood listening, his frustration mounting. They were missing the point, dancing around the core issue with timid legalisms. He felt a friend's hand on his back. "Go on, Hamilton," urged his classmate Robert Troup. "You know more about it than any of them." Panic seized him. He was 18 years old, a penniless immigrant. Who was he to address these men? He shook his head, but others who had heard Troup's encouragement took up the call. "Let the collegian speak," a voice shouted. He was pushed, gently but inexorably, toward the makeshift wooden stage. He mounted the steps, his knees trembling. The faces of the crowd swam before him, a sea of impatient, skeptical eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, and a nervous squeak came out. A few men chuckled. Humiliation washed over him, hot and sharp. And then he remembered the auction. He remembered the magistrate's dismissive gavel, the sneer on John Kerwin's face. He remembered the rage that had forged itself into a promise in his soul. The trembling stopped. He took a deep breath, stood up straight, and began again. "It is not the tea," he said, his voice ringing out clear and steady, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "It is not the tax. It is the principle. It is the cancerous assertion that a distant parliament can command us, can bind us in all cases whatsoever without our consent." He began to build his argument, not with the wild passion of a mob rouser, but with the cold, irrefutable logic of a lawyer, a philosopher. He cited Locke and Montesquieu. He spoke of natural rights, of the social contract, of the sacred bond between the government and the governed, a bond the king had broken. The hesitant boy vanished, replaced by a confident, commanding orator. His accent, once a mark of the outsider, now lent his words a unique, compelling cadence. The crowd fell silent, captivated. This was not the usual rhetoric. This was a mind at work, dissecting tyranny piece by piece and holding it up for all to see. "The liberties of America are an infinite stake," he declared, his voice rising in passion. "We can neither surrender them with honor nor neglect them with safety. Shall we, the colonists who have braved the ocean, who have conquered the wilderness, who have built a new world from nothing, now bow our heads and accept the yoke of slavery?" A roar of "no" erupted from the crowd. "The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records," he thundered, his fist punching the air. "They are written, as with a sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power." He spoke for nearly half an hour, the arguments pouring out of him in a seamless, brilliant torrent. When he finished, breathless and spent, a moment of stunned silence hung over the fields. Then the crowd exploded. Hats flew into the air. A thunderous cheer washed over him. Men who had been strangers minutes before were now clapping him on the back, shaking his hand, their faces alight with a new and fiery resolve. In the space of a single afternoon, the anonymous student from the West Indies had become a voice of the American Revolution. He had found his stage. Soon after, he picked up his quill, this time not to describe a hurricane, but to create one. He began writing a series of anonymous pamphlets, defending the actions of the colonists and intellectually savaging the arguments of the leading loyalist thinkers. Published under the simple signature, "A Friend to America," the pamphlets were masterpieces of political polemic, so sophisticated in their reasoning that many attributed them to seasoned statesmen like John Jay or William Livingston. When the identity of the young collegian was finally revealed, it caused a sensation. Alexander Hamilton had arrived. He had no army, no political office, no fortune to his name. But he had a voice, a quill, and a cause. And he knew, with a certainty that burned in his soul, that he would use them to write himself into the birth certificate of the new nation that was struggling to be born. Chapter 4: Trial by Fire. New York and New Jersey, 1776. The Revolution, once a heady debate in coffee-houses and public squares, now erupted in gunpowder and blood. The Declaration of Independence, scrawled on parchment, quickly became a rallying cry for men who traded their plows and ledgers for muskets and powder horns. Alexander Hamilton, barely 21, was among the first to answer. The call to arms was not merely a patriotic duty. It was an opportunity, a chance to prove himself in the crucible of war, to earn the honor and recognition that birth had denied him. He dropped out of King's College, his studies abruptly halted by the demands of a nation in peril. While many of his peers sought commissions as infantry officers, Alexander, with his keen understanding of logistics and his fascination with precision, set his sights on the artillery. He understood that in a conflict between a trained, disciplined British army and an inexperienced colonial militia, firepower would be decisive. With a speed that astonished his superiors, he raised his own company of artillery. He scoured the city for recruits, drilling them relentlessly, turning raw, nervous recruits into competent gunners. He personally oversaw the procurement of cannon, ammunition, and horses, demonstrating a logistical genius that would soon become legendary. He was a stickler for discipline, a sharp contrast to the often relaxed demeanor of other colonial officers. His men, initially resentful of the young, ambitious immigrant, soon learned to respect his competence and his courage. The war began, for New York, with a resounding disaster. The summer of 1776 saw the largest invasion force in British history descend upon the city. General George Washington, with his ragtag Continental Army, was outmanned, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Alexander's company found itself plunged into a chaotic maelstrom of retreats and desperate stands. He first saw action during the Battle of Long Island. From his position, he commanded his guns with cool precision, his youthful face smudged with powder, his ears ringing with the roar of cannon fire. He directed his men to lay down a punishing barrage, slowing the British advance even as the American lines crumbled around them. He witnessed the horrific efficiency of the British regulars, their coordinated movements a stark contrast to the often disorganized colonial forces. But he also saw the unyielding courage of the American farmer soldiers, men who stood their ground against overwhelming odds. The retreat from Long Island was a nightmare. Under the cover of a providential fog, Washington evacuated his army across the East River to Manhattan. Alexander and his men worked tirelessly, dragging their heavy cannon onto rickety boats, their muscles screaming, their minds dulled by exhaustion and fear. He knew that if the fog had lifted, they would all have been annihilated. It was a close shave, a stark lesson in the fragility of their nascent cause. The series of defeats continued as Washington was driven from Manhattan, then through White Plains, and eventually across the Hudson River into New Jersey. It was a desperate, humiliating retreat. Morale plummeted. Soldiers deserted in droves. The cause of independence seemed all but lost. During these grim weeks, Alexander's leadership shone. His company was always where the fighting was fiercest, providing crucial fire support as Washington desperately tried to keep his army intact. He demonstrated immense personal bravery, often exposing himself to enemy fire to direct his guns, his youthful energy seemingly boundless. He never complained, never wavered. He simply did his duty, meticulously and bravely. He saw the flaws in their fledgling army, the lack of supplies, the short enlistments, the fractured command structure, and began to formulate ideas, scribbling them in his notebook whenever he had a moment of respite. They needed a stronger central government, a more professional army, a more coherent strategy. He was fighting on the battlefield, but his mind was already fighting the political and logistical battles that would determine the war's outcome. Then came the desperate gamble. December 1776. Washington's army, numbering barely a few thousand cold, starving, and demoralized men, was huddled on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. The British, confident of victory, had gone into winter quarters, believing the rebel army was all but finished. Washington, against all conventional military wisdom, decided on a daring, audacious plan, a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton on Christmas night. It was a last, desperate roll of the dice. If it failed, the revolution was likely over. Alexander Hamilton and his artillery company were among the men selected for the crossing. The freezing night was a torment. Blocks of ice choked the Delaware, making the passage treacherous. Men shivered in their thin uniforms, their teeth chattering. Hamilton, shivering like the rest, supervised his men, ensuring the precious cannon were securely loaded onto the Durham boats. He watched Washington's stoic face, illuminated by the glow of a lantern, and felt a surge of grim determination. They would either win or die. The crossing was agonizingly slow. They landed on the New Jersey side hours behind schedule, but the element of surprise remained intact. The Hessians, celebrating Christmas, were asleep, confident in the storm's protection. As dawn broke on December 26th, Alexander found himself marching through a driving sleet, his men hauling their cannon through the snow-covered streets of Trenton. His heart pounded, a drumbeat in his chest matching the rhythm of his feet. Then the alarm. Musket fire erupted. The Hessians, rousted from their beds, scrambled to form ranks. Washington had divided his forces. Hamilton's artillery was positioned at the head of a street leading into the town, directly facing the main Hessian force. His orders were clear: open fire. "Load grape," Hamilton shouted, his voice hoarse but steady. Grape shot, a cluster of small iron balls, would scythe through the enemy ranks. The first volley from his cannon roared, sending a shower of snow and splintered wood into the Hessian formation. Alexander directed his gunners with a ferocity born of desperation. He barked orders, adjusted angles, and personally helped manhandle the heavy guns into position. The concentrated fire from his artillery, combined with the relentless pressure of Washington's infantry, broke the Hessian line. Their general, Colonel Rahl, fell. Confusion turned to panic. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. The Hessians surrendered, almost 1,000 of them taken prisoner, with barely any American casualties. It was a stunning victory, a psychological lifeline for the struggling revolution. In the immediate aftermath, amidst the shouts of triumph and the groans of the wounded, Alexander saw Washington. The general, his usually impassive face alight with relief and pride, moved through the ranks, congratulating his officers. He stopped before Hamilton, his eyes meeting the young captain's. "Captain Hamilton," Washington said, his voice deep and resonant, "your conduct, sir, was exemplary. Your guns made all the difference." Alexander felt a surge of pride, hotter than any fever. The compliment coming from the legendary general was a balm to his soul, a validation of every struggle, every sacrifice. He had faced the fire and he had not been found wanting. He had proven his worth not with his words but with his deeds. General George Washington, the stoic leader of the American Rebellion, had noticed him, and for a young, ambitious orphan that was everything. The world was about to change. Victory at Trenton and the follow-up success at Princeton were jolts of lightning to the near-dead corpse of the Revolution. But as the Continental Army limped into its winter encampment at Morristown, the euphoria faded, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. The army was a fragile, shivering thing, held together by the sheer force of General George Washington's will. Washington's headquarters, a commandeered tavern, was the nerve center of this desperate enterprise. The general was besieged not by British regulars but by a relentless onslaught of paper. Dispatches from Congress, pleas from state governors, reports from spies, endless requisitions for food, blankets, and gunpowder. It was a blizzard of ink that threatened to bury the cause as surely as any enemy battalion. Washington was a commander, not a clerk. He needed a mind as sharp as his sword, an aide who could not only manage the chaos but anticipate it. He had been watching the young artillery captain. He'd seen Hamilton's bravery at Trenton, but more importantly, he'd heard of his intellect, his organizational skill, and the powerful, articulate letters he wrote on behalf of his commanding officers. In a war fought as much with persuasion as with muskets, a man who could command the English language was an invaluable asset. In early March, a summons was sent. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton was to present himself at the general's headquarters. Alexander arrived, his uniform brushed, his boots polished, his heart a nervous drum against his ribs. He was ushered into Washington's private office. The general stood by a large map pinned to the wall, his formidable height seeming to shrink the already small room. He was not the marble icon of later years. He was a tired, 45-year-old man with the weight of a nation on his shoulders, his face etched with worry. "Colonel Hamilton," Washington began, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention without effort. "Thank you for coming. I will be plain. I am in need of an addition to my official family, an aide-de-camp. The work is not glamorous. It is a torrent of correspondence, of reports, of endless details. It requires a quick mind and a tireless pen." He paused, his gaze steady and searching. "I am told you possess both." Alexander's mind reeled. This was the offer of a lifetime, a position at the very center of the war, at the right hand of the commander-in-chief. It was a path to influence and consequence far beyond what a captain of artillery could ever hope for. But it also meant leaving the battlefield. It meant trading the cannon's roar for the quill's scratch, glory for paperwork. The thirst for battlefield honor, the desperate need to prove his courage, was a fire in his soul. "General," Alexander said carefully, "I am honored beyond words. My only hesitation is a desire to be of service in the field where the fighting is." A flicker of understanding, perhaps even amusement, crossed Washington's face. He knew the siren song of glory. "I understand, Colonel. Every young man of spirit feels the same. But let me assure you, the war is not won only on the battlefield. It is won here," he said, tapping a stack of papers on his desk. "It is won by keeping the states from squabbling, by convincing Congress to send supplies, by holding this army together with little more than promises and ink. The quill can be as vital as the sword." Washington saw more than just a clerk. He saw the fire in the young man's eyes, the restless intelligence. He saw a fellow outsider, a man not from the Boston intellectual elite or the Philadelphia merchant class, but a Virginian planter who, like Hamilton, had learned his trade through hard experience. He sensed a shared ambition, a mutual and ferocious devotion to the cause. Alexander looked at the towering figure before him, the one man who seemed to be holding the entire revolution aloft by his own strength. To be a part of that, to lend his own energy to that central effort, it was a higher calling. He made his decision. "I accept, Your Excellency," he said, his voice firm. "I will serve in any capacity you see fit." The work was every bit as relentless as Washington had promised. From that day forward, Alexander lived at the heart of the hurricane. He rose before dawn and often worked until long after midnight, his desk one of the few in the camp that always had a candle burning. He became Washington's filter, his voice, and often his mind. He drafted letters to the Continental Congress, his elegant prose artfully blending deference with a firm, almost demanding, insistence on the Army's needs. He wrote to governors, cajoling them for militia and supplies. He composed strategic orders to other generals, translating Washington's broad commands into precise, actionable intelligence. His fluency in French, learned as a boy in the Caribbean, made him the primary liaison with the growing number of French officers, like the young and idealistic Marquis de Lafayette, who were arriving to aid their cause. Washington would pace the room, dictating the substance of a letter, a jumble of thoughts and frustrations. Alexander would listen, scribble a few notes, and then retreat to his desk. An hour later he would return with a perfectly crafted document, the general's raw emotions refined into prose that was at once powerful, logical, and politically astute. Washington would read it over, make a minor change or two, and nod. "Sign it for me," he'd say, and with a flourish, Alexander would pen the elegant signature, G. Washington. A deep, almost paternal bond began to form between the two men. Washington, who had no biological children of his own, saw in Hamilton the brilliant son he never had. He admired the boy's ferocious work ethic, his boundless energy, and his unwavering loyalty. He came to rely on Hamilton's counsel, often asking for his opinion on military and political matters. For Alexander, Washington was the father he had always craved. James Hamilton had been a ghost, a source of shame. George Washington was an anchor. He was the embodiment of integrity, dignity, and selfless leadership. Alexander studied him, learning not just about military strategy, but about how to command respect, how to navigate treacherous political waters, and how to project an aura of unshakable calm, even in the face of disaster. He became one of Washington's family of aides, a band of bright, dedicated young men who worked, ate, and lived together in the close confines of the headquarters. But even among this elite group, Hamilton was first among equals. He was the one who worked the longest hours, the one who grasped the complexities of a situation most quickly, the one whose pen was the sharpest. He was not just an aide. He was becoming the general's indispensable right-hand man. He had traded his cannon for a quill, but as Washington predicted, the new weapon was proving to be far more powerful. Chapter 6. The Winter at Valley Forge. Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, winter 1777–1778. Valley Forge was not a battle, it was a siege of the human spirit. After a series of defeats, including the loss of the capital city, Philadelphia, Washington marched his exhausted and bloodied army into a shallow, windswept valley for the winter. The name itself would become a synonym for suffering. There were no barracks, only frozen, unforgiving ground. The men, 11,000 of them, were tasked with building their own crude log huts, their hands raw and bleeding from the unfamiliar work of felling trees in the punishing cold. Their uniforms were rags, their shoes had disintegrated on the long marches, and many left trails of blood in the snow from their bare, frost-bitten feet. Food was a rumor. Disease, typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, was a constant, silent predator, stalking the camp and claiming more lives than British muskets ever had. From his small stone headquarters, Alexander Hamilton waged his own war against this new enemy, despair. The suffering of the soldiers was a constant, visceral presence. He saw it in the hollow eyes of the sentries, in the gaunt faces of men huddled around sputtering fires, in the daily count of the dead, which grew with horrifying speed. The quill was his weapon, and he wielded it with a cold fury. He worked at a pace that left other aides breathless. His days were a desperate scramble to conjure supplies from nothing. He wrote scathing, impassioned letters to the Continental Congress, whose incompetence and indifference were starving the army into oblivion. An army is a complicated machine, he argued in one dispatch, the words practically leaping from the page with frustration. To expect it to function without adequate provisions, without the sinews of money and the lifeblood of supply, is to expect an effect without a cause. We are witnessing a tragedy of epic proportions, not at the hands of the British, but at the hands of our own mismanagement. He wrote to state governors, pleading, flattering, and threatening them in turn to meet their quotas for men and materiel. He developed a comprehensive plan for reorganizing the Army's supply departments, a brilliant but radical proposal that Congress would, in its infinite lethargy, largely ignore. Every day was a fresh lesson in the weakness of a decentralized government, a lesson he would burn into his memory. In this crucible of misery, his bonds with his fellow aides deepened into a true brotherhood. They were his family, forged in shared hardship and a common, desperate cause. There was the Marquis de Lafayette, the impossibly wealthy and idealistic French aristocrat, whose boyish enthusiasm was a flickering candle in the gloom. He and Hamilton would spend hours talking, their French fluent and rapid, sharing dreams of a world governed by liberty and reason. And then there was John Laurens, the handsome, chivalrous son of a wealthy South Carolina slave trader. Laurens was a man at war with his own inheritance. He was a fervent abolitionist, a belief he shared with Hamilton. In the dead of night, huddled for warmth in their cramped quarters, they would speak of the Revolution's glaring hypocrisy, a fight for liberty that was sustained by the institution of slavery. How can we demand from tyranny what we exact from those in our power? Laurens would argue, his voice filled with a passionate, almost painful sincerity. We cannot, Hamilton would agree, the injustice of it igniting his own memories of the slave markets in St. Croix. The fault is not in our ideals, Laurens, but in our failure to live up to them. After the war, we must champion a plan for emancipation. A battalion of freed slaves fighting for their own liberty. What could be a more powerful statement? This shared dream, this radical notion of a truly free America, bound them together with a profound intimacy. In their letters, they would refer to each other as "my dear Laurens" and "my dear Hamilton," their affection a testament to a connection that transcended mere friendship. While the army froze, a more insidious threat festered in the warm drawing rooms of Philadelphia and York, a political conspiracy to oust Washington from command. Known as the Conway Cabal, It was a loose-knit group of ambitious officers and frustrated congressmen who saw Washington's defeats as a sign of incompetence. They championed General Horatio Gates, the so-called hero of Saratoga, as his replacement. The cabal was a dagger aimed at the heart of the revolution. Washington's leadership was the one thing holding the fragile cause together. Hamilton saw the danger immediately and became the general's fiercest defender. He used his pen like a rapier, drafting letters on Washington's behalf that masterfully exposed the plotters' ambitions while maintaining a dignified, unimpeachable high ground. He gathered intelligence, managed the public perception, and worked to isolate the conspirators. It was a vicious, ugly political fight, and Hamilton's first taste of the partisan venom that would define his later career. Slowly, agonizingly, the winter began to turn. The cabal, exposed and outmaneuvered, collapsed under the weight of Washington's immense popular support. Then came two arrivals that changed everything. The first was a man who called himself Baron von Steuben, a Prussian drill master of questionable aristocratic lineage but unquestionable military genius. He spoke almost no English, but with Hamilton and Lawrence acting as his translators, he began to systematically retrain the Continental Army. He cursed the men in German and French, drilled them until they dropped, and taught them the brutal, beautiful ballet of the bayonet. And through it all, he transformed a ragged militia into a disciplined, professional fighting force. For the first time, a sense of pride and competence began to seep back into the camp. The second arrival was not a person, but a piece of paper, a dispatch from Paris. France, convinced by the victory at Saratoga that the American cause was viable, had officially recognized the United States and signed a treaty of military alliance. The news swept through Valley Forge like a wildfire. Cannons were fired in salute. Men who had been on the verge of starvation just weeks before cheered until they were hoarse. Hamilton stood beside Washington on the makeshift parade ground, watching the gaunt, scarred, but now disciplined soldiers march in review. They were survivors. The winter at Valley Forge had not broken them. It had forged them into something new, something harder and more resilient. The French alliance meant money, ships, and soldiers. It meant they were no longer alone. It meant they could win. The ordeal was over. Alexander Hamilton had walked through the Revolution's darkest valley and emerged on the other side. His convictions hardened, his loyalty to Washington absolute, and his vision for a strong, centralized American nation more fiercely held than ever. Chapter 7. A Schuyler Sister. Morristown, New Jersey, winter 1780. The war had found a grinding, attritional rhythm. The great, sweeping campaigns of the early years had given way to a tense stalemate, a war of patrols, skirmishes, and, above all, waiting. The army was once again encamped at Morristown, and though this winter was less brutal than the one at Valley Forge, it was filled with a dreary, soul-crushing monotony. For Alexander Hamilton, now Washington's most senior and trusted aide, the waiting was a form of torture. His mind, always racing, chafed at the slow pace of the war. He was 25 years old, a veteran of 4 years of conflict, and yet his personal life was a blank ledger. He had a found family in Washington and his fellow aides, but he had no home, no anchor to call his own. His world tilted on its axis in February. General Washington needed to confer with General Philip Schuyler, the powerful and respected New York commander, about a potential joint operation with the French. He entrusted the sensitive diplomatic mission to Hamilton. This meant a journey to the Schuyler residence, where the general's family was staying for the season. The Schuyler name was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. They were Dutch aristocracy, owners of vast tracts of land in the Hudson Valley, their influence woven into the very fabric of New York. To marry a Schuyler was to marry into the heart of the American project. Alexander arrived not at a military tent, but at a bustling, comfortable home filled with the warmth of family and the quiet confidence of old money. It was there he was formally introduced to the general's daughters. He had met them briefly before, but this was different. He was first struck by Angelica. The eldest, she was brilliant, witty, and possessed a political mind as sharp as his own. When they spoke, it was like the striking of flint on steel, a shower of sparks. She had read the same philosophers, understood the same complexities of the war, and matched his intellectual fire with a captivating, flirtatious confidence. He was instantly, powerfully dazzled. Here was a mind that could dance with his, a woman who saw the world with the same sharp, unsentimental clarity. Then he turned and saw her sister, Elizabeth. Everyone called her Eliza. Where Angelica was a blazing fire, Eliza was a hearth, a source of steady, unwavering warmth. She was not as overtly brilliant as her sister, but she possessed a deep, soulful intelligence and a kindness that radiated from her dark, expressive eyes. She watched him not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a man to be understood. While Angelica had challenged his mind, Eliza seemed to see straight into his restless, guarded heart. That evening, at a small ball held for the officers, the contrast became even clearer. He danced with Angelica, and their conversation was a thrilling duel of wits. He danced with Eliza, and for the first time since the war began, his mind grew quiet. He found himself telling her not of his ambitions, but of his childhood in the Caribbean, a story he rarely shared. He spoke of the hurricane, and she listened with an empathy so profound it felt like a physical comfort. He looked into her face, a vision of grace and strength, and was struck by a revelation that was both terrifying and exhilarating. This was it. This was the peace he had never known he was searching for. Love, for him, was not going to be a battle of minds. It was going to be a sanctuary. He fell for her with the same speed and totality that he did everything else. His courtship was a campaign, waged with the full force of his intellect and passion. He was a prodigious, brilliant letter writer, and he flooded Eliza with correspondence that was by turns charming, philosophical, and intensely romantic. "I have a penchant for all that is amiable and handsome," he wrote to her, "but I have a penchant of a different kind for you. You have both my heart and my head, and you will not be mistaken if you believe that I am yours with the most sincere and ardent affection." He had to win over not just Eliza, but her formidable father. General Schuyler was a shrewd judge of men. He knew Hamilton was an orphan with no land and no money, a background that would have disqualified him in the eyes of most fathers of his station. But Schuyler also saw what Washington saw, a young man of astonishing talent, boundless ambition, and unshakable integrity. He saw the future of the new nation in Alexander's brilliant, restless eyes. When Hamilton formally asked for Eliza's hand, the general gave his blessing without hesitation. They were wed in December of 1780 in the grand parlor of the Schuyler Mansion in Albany. The room was filled with the luminaries of the Revolution, military officers, and political leaders. Alexander stood at the altar, resplendent in his blue Continental Army dress uniform. As Eliza walked towards him, her face serene and luminous, a profound sense of peace settled over him. He was no longer the obscene bastard child from the islands. He was no longer the rootless, striving outsider. By this single act, he had gained everything he had ever lacked: a home, a family, and an unimpeachable place within the society he was fighting to create. He had married for love, a love as deep and true as any he had ever imagined. But he had also married into the very bedrock of America. Eliza Schuyler was his anchor, the fixed point around which his own chaotic, hurricane-force life could now revolve. Yet, as he held his new wife's hand, a familiar restlessness stirred within him. He had a family. Now he needed to build a legacy worthy of them. The war was not yet over, and the glory he had craved since he was a boy on a blood-soaked battlefield in Trenton still called to him.
Chapter 8. The World Turned Upside Down. New Windsor, New York, 1781. Marriage had given Alexander a home, but it had not given him peace. The winter of 1781 found him more restless than ever. From his desk at Washington's headquarters, he watched the war unfold at a frustrating distance. He saw men of far lesser talent, like the feckless General Charles Lee, bungle commands and still retain their positions. He saw his friend Lafayette leading troops in Virginia, earning the very glory that he himself was denied. For 4 years, he had been the indispensable man in the shadows, the engine of Washington's administration. He had held the army together with his quill, but his soul craved the sword. He was a lion trapped in a clerk's cage, and his frustration was beginning to fester. Every dispatch he wrote detailing another officer's field command felt like a personal insult. He was a father-to-be. Eliza was pregnant with their first child, Philip, and the need to forge a legacy, to have a story of heroism to tell his son, was an all-consuming fire. The breaking point came on a cold February morning. It was a trivial matter, a spark landing in a powder keg of accumulated resentment. Hamilton was walking down the stairs at headquarters when he encountered General Washington walking up. "Colonel Hamilton," Washington said, his tone abrupt, "I need to see you." "I will wait on you immediately, sir," Alexander replied, and continued down the stairs to first deliver a pressing letter he was carrying. He took no more than a minute, but when he returned to Washington's office, the general was waiting, his face a thundercloud. An aide intercepted Hamilton at the door. "The general has told me you are to be informed that he is waiting for you." Hamilton entered the office. Before he could speak, Washington's tightly controlled temper, frayed by years of stress, finally snapped. "Colonel Hamilton," he said, his voice cold with anger, "you have kept me waiting at the head of the stairs these 10 minutes. I must tell you, sir, you treat me with disrespect." 10 minutes, it had been 2 at most. The injustice of the accusation, the public nature of the rebuke, struck Hamilton's pride like a physical blow. The years of suppressed ambition, the feeling of being treated as a subordinate rather than a partner, boiled over. "I am not conscious of it, sir," Hamilton replied, his own voice dangerously quiet. "But since you have thought it necessary to tell me so, we part." The words hung in the air, sharp and irrevocable as shattered glass. Washington was stunned into silence. He had expected an apology, not a resignation. "Very well, sir," Washington said finally, his voice regaining its icy composure. "If it be your choice." An hour later, Washington, having had time to cool down and realize the magnitude of his potential loss, sent an aide to Hamilton's quarters with an olive branch. He wished to speak with him to find a way to heal the breach. But Hamilton's pride was a fortress. The insult had been public. Any reconciliation had to be on his terms. He refused the meeting. The break was clean. He was finally free from the general's shadow. He was also unemployed and adrift. He returned to Eliza, who was now staying with him near the camp, and tried to explain the storm that had just broken. He was still an officer, but he was a man without a mission. The freedom he thought he craved felt like a void. He immediately began a relentless letter-writing campaign to Washington, formally and repeatedly requesting a field command. He was direct, bordering on insubordinate. "I am convinced," he wrote, "that the year will see the end of the war, and I am anxious to participate in the final glory." Washington, either still wounded by their argument or genuinely believing Hamilton was more valuable as a strategist, demurred. He offered him a different role, a liaison position, anything but command of troops in battle. Hamilton refused them all. As spring turned to summer, the war's center of gravity shifted decisively south. General Cornwallis, the commander of the main British army in the south, had marched his forces into Virginia and fortified himself at a small tobacco port on the Chesapeake Bay called Yorktown. Washington saw the opportunity of a lifetime. In a brilliant feat of deception, he feigned an attack on New York City, then marched the bulk of the American and French armies 400 miles south to trap Cornwallis. This was it. This would be the final, decisive battle of the war. For Hamilton, the thought of sitting it out was an agony beyond endurance. It was now or never. He rode to Washington's headquarters as the army was preparing to march and made one last, desperate appeal. He did not beg, he all but issued an ultimatum. He laid his commission on the table. "Give me a command, or I resign from the army." Washington looked at the young man before him, so brilliant, so proud, so impossibly stubborn. He saw the same fire that had impressed him at Trenton, the same mind that had saved him at Valley Forge. He could not afford to lose him, and perhaps in the end, he knew the boy had earned his chance. "You will have your command, Colonel," Washington said, his voice heavy with resignation. Hamilton was given command of a battalion of elite light infantry. The relief and joy that flooded through him was so intense it almost brought him to his knees. The siege of Yorktown was a masterpiece of military engineering. The Allied armies, outnumbering the British 2-1, dug a series of parallel trenches, drawing an ever-tightening noose around the British defenses. The key to breaking the stalemate lay in two critical British outposts, earthen forts known as Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10. They had to be taken. The French were assigned to assault Redoubt 9, the Americans Redoubt 10. Lafayette was given overall command of the American operation, and he initially gave command of the assault to another officer. Hamilton was incandescent with rage. This was his moment. He went straight to Lafayette and then to Washington, arguing that by seniority and rotation, the command was rightfully his. It was an audacious, almost unprofessional display of raw ambition. Washington, weary of the drama but recognizing the justice of his claim, relented. The assault on Redoubt 10 belonged to Hamilton. On the night of October 14th, under a black, moonless sky, Hamilton gathered his men. To ensure stealth, he ordered them to unload their muskets. This would be an attack with bayonets only. It was a terrifying order, a demand for absolute courage. He stood before them, a slight figure in the darkness, his face grim with determination. He could feel the thrum of their fear and excitement. It matched his own. This was the culmination of his entire life, the orphan from the island, the clerk from the counting house, the aide from the headquarters, all of it had led to this single desperate charge into the mouth of a cannon. At the signal, he sprang forward. "Forward!" he screamed, his voice raw. He did not lead from the back. He ran at the head of his men, a whirlwind of motion. They crossed the open ground under a hail of British musket fire. Men fell around him, but he never slowed. He reached the abattis, a tangle of sharpened branches protecting the fort, and hacked his way through with his sword. He was the first to reach the ditch at the base of the redoubt's wall. He did not wait for the sappers to clear a path. He found the shoulder of one of his soldiers, used him as a foothold, and physically vaulted himself up and over the wooden parapet, landing in the heart of the fortification. His men, inspired by his reckless courage, swarmed in behind him. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters combat, a chaotic ballet of bayonet thrusts and guttural screams in the dark. It was over in less than 10 minutes. The British, overwhelmed, threw down their arms and surrendered. Hamilton stood on the captured earthwork, breathing heavily, his uniform torn, his face smeared with dirt and gunpowder. He was alive. He was victorious. He had stared into the face of death and had not flinched. The French, on their side, had taken Redoubt 9. The last line of British defense was broken. A few days later, the British cannons fell silent. A lone drummer boy mounted the British parapet, beating the call for a parley. The surrender was negotiated. On October 19th, the entire British army marched out from their fortifications, their colors cased, and laid down their arms. As their regimental bands played a hauntingly appropriate tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," Alexander Hamilton stood and watched, his heart swelling with a fierce, triumphant pride. He had his glory. The war was won, and the world, in no small part because of a bastard orphan from a forgotten island, had indeed been turned upside down. Part III, The Architect and the Agonist. Chapter 9, Forging a Nation. New York and Philadelphia, 1782-1788. The thunder of the cannons had been replaced by the cacophony of squabbling politicians. Victory had been achieved, but peace was proving to be a far more formidable enemy. The 13 United States were united in name only, a loose and jealous confederation lurching towards bankruptcy and civil war. The Articles of Confederation, the flimsy legal scaffolding of the new republic, were buckling under the weight of state rivalries and a mountain of debt. Alexander Hamilton, now a celebrated war hero and one of New York's most sought-after lawyers, watched the slow-motion collapse with a mounting sense of horror and impatience. He had not survived British muskets and the frozen hell of Valley Forge only to see the entire enterprise dissolve into chaos. To him, the problem was obvious. The nation lacked a spine. Congress was a beggar, unable to levy taxes. The states treated each other like foreign rivals, imposing tariffs and printing their own worthless currencies. An uprising of indebted farmers in Massachusetts, known as Shays' Rebellion, was a terrifying symptom of the disease. The Republic was dying in its cradle. While others celebrated their newfound freedom, Hamilton was already fighting a new war, a war for order, for structure, for a government with the power to govern. He wrote essays, he corresponded with influential men like Washington and James Madison, and he used his seat in the toothless Congress of the Confederation to argue relentlessly for a stronger national authority. He was a physician trying to prescribe life-saving surgery to a patient who refused to believe it was sick. His moment came in 1787. Frustrated by the failure of a smaller trade conference in Annapolis, Hamilton drafted the call for a grand convention in Philadelphia, with the express purpose of rendering the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. It was a bold, almost revolutionary act. The Philadelphia summer was brutally hot, the air in the State House thick and stifling. Behind locked doors and shuttered windows, a collection of the finest minds in America gathered to debate the fate of the nation. Hamilton, a delegate from New York, arrived with a vision that was radical, audacious, and utterly his own. He had spent months studying the rise and fall of republics throughout history, and he had concluded that democratic excess, not monarchical power, was the true threat. In a marathon 6-hour speech, he laid out his plan. He called for a president and senators who would be elected for life, serving on good behavior. He advocated for a powerful national government that would all but erase the sovereignty of the individual states. It was a brilliant, logical, and deeply researched argument. It was also a political catastrophe. The other delegates were stunned into silence. They had come to amend the Articles, not to create a new American monarchy. They respected Hamilton's intellect, but they recoiled from his conclusions. Had they fought a war against King George only to create a new one of their own? In that single, sweltering afternoon, Hamilton had branded himself an extremist. He was admired but isolated, his proposals quietly shelved. The convention's center of gravity shifted to the more moderate, pragmatic James Madison, whose Virginia Plan would become the blueprint for the final document. For a man of Hamilton's pride, it was a profound humiliation. He had been outmaneuvered, his grand vision dismissed. A lesser man might have retreated, sulking in the knowledge that he had been right. But Hamilton was a pragmatist above all else. His goal was not to be proven right, his goal was to save the nation. He watched as the delegates argued, compromised, and finally, miraculously, produced a new constitution. It was not the powerful, centralized machine he had designed. It was a messy, imperfect bundle of compromises between the large states and the small, the North and the South. But it had a spine. It had a president with real power. It had a Congress that could tax. It was, he realized, their last best hope. And so, the convention's most ardent monarchist transformed into the Constitution's most passionate champion. The fight now shifted from the secret debates of Philadelphia to the public arena of ratification. The proposed Constitution needed the approval of 9 of the 13 states, and nowhere was the opposition stronger than in his own state of New York. The powerful governor, George Clinton, led a formidable anti-federalist faction that saw the Constitution as a blueprint for tyranny. Hamilton knew that if New York voted no, the Union would be fractured, perhaps fatally. He had to win the war of ideas. He conceived of a project of breathtaking ambition, a series of anonymous essays published in New York newspapers that would systematically dismantle every argument against the Constitution and make an irrefutable case for its adoption. He recruited 2 collaborators, the esteemed diplomat John Jay and his intellectual rival from the convention, James Madison. Working under the collective pseudonym Publius, they began their work. Jay, after falling ill, would write only 5. Madison, a brilliant political theorist, would write 29. But the project belonged to Hamilton. He became a force of nature, an intellectual whirlwind. From his law office on Wall Street, he produced a torrent of prose that was simply staggering. He wrote while riding in carriages, while sailing on ferries, and late into the night, his candle burning long after the rest of the city was asleep. He wrote 51 of the 85 essays himself. The result was the Federalist Papers, the single greatest work of political theory in American history. In one essay, he would dissect the necessity of a standing army. In the next, he would eloquently defend the powers of the judiciary or the logic of the Electoral College. His writing was clear, forceful, and relentlessly logical. It was the culmination of his life's learning, from the counting house in St. Croix to the battlefields of the Revolution. It was his grand, irrefutable argument for order in the face of chaos. The essays were a sensation. They were reprinted in newspapers across the country, shaping the debate from New Hampshire to Georgia. When the New York ratifying convention met, it was still heavily stacked against the Constitution. Hamilton, a delegate himself, debated furiously for 6 weeks, using the arguments he had honed in the essays to wear down the opposition. Finally, news arrived that New Hampshire and Virginia had ratified, making the Union a reality. The tide in New York turned. By a razor-thin margin of 3 votes, New York approved the Constitution. The battle was won. The ship of state, which had been sinking into a sea of debt and disunion, now had a new, sturdy hull and a strong rudder. The United States of America was no longer just an idea. It was a government. And Alexander Hamilton, more than any other man, had been its architect, forging a nation not with a sword, but with the relentless, unstoppable power of his quill. Chapter 10. The Secretary's Gambit. New York City, 1789-1790. The new government was a magnificent blueprint with no foundation. The Constitution was ratified, George Washington was president, but the United States of America was, for all practical purposes, a failed state. The nation was drowning in a sea of debt, a staggering $77 million owed to foreign governments, wealthy speculators, and its own long-suffering soldiers who had been paid in IOUs that were now worth pennies on the dollar. The country had no credit, no treasury, and no reliable source of income. It was a republic in theory and a pauper in practice. President Washington knew there was only one man in America with the audacity and intellectual firepower to tackle a crisis of this magnitude. He summoned Alexander Hamilton, now 34 years old, to become the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. It was, in many ways, the job Hamilton had been preparing for his entire life, from his first days logging shipments in the St. Croix counting house. He accepted without hesitation. Working from a modest office on Broadway, Hamilton embarked on the most ambitious project of his life. He labored with a demonic intensity, consulting with financiers, studying the economic systems of Great Britain and France, and drafting a comprehensive plan to resurrect the American economy. After months of relentless work, he presented his report on public credit to Congress. It was not a report, it was a revolution. The plan was built on a series of audacious and deeply controversial pillars. First, the federal government would assume all the war debts of the individual states. Hamilton argued that the debt was incurred for a common cause, independence, and should be paid by a common effort. This would consolidate power in the national government and bind the states to its survival. Second, the government would fund the debt at its full face value. This meant paying off the old IOUs not at their worthless current market rate, but at the price printed on the paper. He argued this was essential to establish the nation's credit. To the world, America had to be a nation that paid its debts. Third, he proposed the creation of a Bank of the United States, a powerful, privately owned but publicly funded institution that would manage the government's finances, issue a stable national currency, and provide loans to businesses, jump-starting the economy. To his allies, the plan was a work of genius, a bold stroke that would transform America from an international laughingstock into a modern economic power. To his opponents, it was a devil's bargain. The opposition was led by an unexpected figure, James Madison. His brilliant collaborator on the Federalist Papers was now a leading voice in Congress, and he was horrified. He saw Hamilton's plan as a betrayal of the revolution's spirit. Funding the debt at face value, he argued, would create a new aristocracy of wealthy speculators who had bought the worthless notes from poor soldiers for next to nothing. It was a scheme to reward the rich and punish the virtuous. He was soon joined by a far more formidable adversary. From his post as Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the tall, soft-spoken Virginian aristocrat, looked at Hamilton's system and saw the creeping shadow of British corruption. A national bank, a powerful central government funded by debt and beholden to northern financiers. This was not the agrarian republic of independent farmers he had envisioned. This was the world they had fought a war to escape. The battle for the soul of America had begun. The debate in Congress was vicious and paralyzing. Madison, a master of parliamentary procedure, managed to block Hamilton's assumption plan. The southern states, many of which, like Virginia, had already paid off most of their debts, saw no reason to be taxed to pay for the profligacy of Massachusetts and South Carolina. The government ground to a halt. The future of the republic hung in the balance. Hamilton, watching his grand vision about to be strangled in its cradle by his former friend, knew that logic and debate were not enough. He needed a political masterstroke. The opportunity came one evening in late June 1790, as Jefferson was leaving the president's residence. He saw Hamilton packing outside, his face a mask of frustration and despair. Jefferson, though his rival, was alarmed by the secretary's haggard appearance and the genuine crisis at hand. He invited Hamilton to dinner at his home, offering to include Madison to see if some compromise could be reached. The dinner was held in Jefferson's elegant private dining room. Over fine wine and Virginian cuisine, the three men, the immigrant financial wizard, the Virginian philosopher king, and the brilliant constitutional scholar, sat down to decide the nation's fate. The air was thick with tension. Hamilton, in his typically forceful manner, argued that without assumption, the Union would dissolve. The nation's credit would be worthless, and they would be prey to the great powers of Europe. Madison countered with the injustice of the plan to his Southern constituents. Jefferson, playing the role of the honest broker, saw an opening. There was another, seemingly unrelated issue that was also deadlocked in Congress: the permanent location of the national capital. The northern states wanted it to remain in New York or move to Philadelphia. The southern states, hungry for the power and influence the capital would bring, desperately wanted it on the banks of the Potomac River. A bargain was struck. The details were never written down, only whispered in the candlelit room. Jefferson and Madison would secure the crucial Southern votes to pass Hamilton's debt assumption plan. In exchange, Hamilton would use his influence with the Northern delegates to ensure the new capital would be built on the Potomac. It was a cynical, brilliant piece of political horse trading. A few weeks later, the Assumption Bill passed Congress by a narrow margin. Hamilton's financial system was enacted. The United States was placed on the path to becoming an economic superpower, and the nation's capital would one day be Washington, D.C., a city carved from the swamps bordering Virginia and Maryland. Hamilton had won. He had saved the country from financial ruin and secured his vision of a powerful, energetic national government. But the cost was immense. The dinner table bargain did not heal the rift, it codified it. The ideological chasm between Hamilton and the Virginians was now unbridgeable. From the ashes of this fight, the nation's first political parties, Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, would rise. The man who had forged the nation was now a deeply polarizing figure, the agonist in a political drama that would consume the rest of his life. Chapter 11, The Serpent in the Garden. Philadelphia, 1790-11794. Philadelphia was the new capital, a city of Quaker brick and revolutionary ideals, but the political atmosphere had turned venomous. The fragile unity forged in war had fractured completely. The intellectual disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson had metastasized into a vicious, public feud that defined the nation's politics. This was no longer a debate. It was a war for the American soul. It was a war fought in the press. Hamilton, with his allies, backed John Fenno's Gazette of the United States, the administration's semi-official mouthpiece. Jefferson, with a quiet subsidy from the State Department, established Philip Freneau's National Gazette, a fiercely partisan paper dedicated to one purpose: destroying Alexander Hamilton. The pages of the papers became a weekly bloodsport. Hamilton, writing under a host of Roman pseudonyms, was a gladiator, defending his policies with intricate logic and slashing at his opponents with devastating wit. Freneau's paper, in turn, painted Hamilton as Montezuma, an aspiring monarch, a treasury secretary scheming to crown himself king and enslave the yeoman farmer to a cabal of northern bankers. The personal attacks grew uglier, the rhetoric more incendiary. The cabinet, intended as the president's council of advisors, became a battleground, with Hamilton and Jefferson clashing so violently that Washington had to personally intervene, pleading with them for civility. In the summer of 1791, the political heat was matched by the city's oppressive humidity. Eliza, as she often did, had taken the children north to the relative cool of her family home in Albany, escaping the ever-present threat of the yellow fever that plagued the city. Hamilton, as usual, stayed behind. He was a man addicted to his work, a general who could not leave his post. But the long, solitary evenings in his empty house began to wear on him. He was at the zenith of his power, the second most influential man in America, yet he was profoundly lonely. One evening, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find a young woman, perhaps 23, her face a study in cultivated distress. She introduced herself as Maria Reynolds. She was beautiful, with a fragile, vulnerable air that seemed out of place in the hard-edged city. Weeping, she spun a tale of woe. Her husband had abandoned her, she was penniless, and she needed to get back to her family in New York. Could the great Secretary Hamilton, a man known to be from New York himself, possibly help her? It was a performance, and Hamilton was its target audience. His pride, his sense of chivalry, his vanity, she played upon them all. He was a powerful man, and here was a damsel in distress appealing to his better nature. He gave her some money from his wallet and, promising to bring more, agreed to walk her to the boarding house where she was staying. He knew he should have left her at the door. Every instinct, honed by years of political intrigue, screamed that this was a mistake. But his loneliness, his arrogance, and a powerful surge of physical attraction conspired against his better judgment. She invited him in. He accepted. The garden of his life had a serpent at its gate, and he had just welcomed it inside. The affair that followed was brief, sordid, and reckless. It was a momentary escape from the crushing pressures of his office and the emptiness of his house. It was also a catastrophic miscalculation. A few weeks into their trysts, the serpent showed its fangs. Hamilton received a frantic letter from Maria, followed by a visit from her supposedly long-lost husband, James Reynolds. Reynolds was a known grifter, a small-time speculator with a loathsome reputation. He was not a cuckolded husband seeking revenge. He was a predator who had just sprung his trap. With feigned outrage, he accused Hamilton of destroying his marriage and demanded satisfaction, not with a pistol, but with a price. $1,000, or he would go to Eliza. Hamilton was caught. A public scandal would not only destroy his family and humiliate his beloved wife, it would be a weapon of mass destruction in the hands of his political enemies. His entire financial system, the very foundation of the Republic, was built on his personal reputation for unimpeachable integrity. He paid the blackmail. He tried to end the affair, but the Reynoldses were relentless. They had a hold on him, and they would not let go. The demands for money continued, small sums here and there, a constant, humiliating drain on his personal finances. While Hamilton was trapped in this private hell, his public life was coming under assault. His enemies, led by Jefferson and Madison, were convinced he was corrupt. They could not believe his financial system was anything other than a grand scheme for personal enrichment. They began to hear whispers, rumors that the Secretary of the Treasury was engaged in secret, illegal speculation with a known swindler named James Reynolds. The blackmail payments, which Hamilton made from his own accounts, were mistaken for evidence of a criminal conspiracy. In December of 1792, a delegation of Jefferson's allies in Congress, led by James Monroe and Frederick Muhlenberg, requested a private meeting with the secretary. They came armed with what they believed was irrefutable evidence of his guilt, canceled checks and letters between Hamilton and Reynolds. They were about to expose the great man and bring his entire Federalist edifice crashing down. They confronted him in his office. They laid out their charges, that he had used government funds to engage in illegal speculation with James Reynolds. Hamilton felt the world shrink to the confines of the room. He was standing on a precipice. In one direction lay public ruin, to be branded a corrupt official, the very thing his enemies had claimed all along. This would not just destroy him, it would invalidate his life's work and potentially unravel the nation's fragile economy. In the other direction lay a different kind of ruin, a deeply personal one. He could prove his public innocence, but only by revealing his private shame. For Alexander Hamilton, the choice was agonizing but clear. His honor as a public servant was paramount. His legacy was the nation he had built. He would sacrifice his personal reputation to save it. He took a deep breath. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "I am not guilty of what you suppose, but I am guilty of another crime, one of which you have no suspicion."
He unlocked a drawer in his desk and began to lay out the evidence of his own disgrace. The desperate, cloying letters from Maria, his own replies, the sordid blackmail notes from her husband. He narrated the entire affair, from the first knock on his door to the final, humiliating payment. He spared no detail, his face a mask of cold self-loathing. He was sacrificing his pride on the altar of his public duty. The congressmen were stunned into silence. They had come expecting to find a criminal. Instead, they had found a sinner. The evidence was undeniable. Hamilton was not guilty of financial corruption. He was guilty of adultery. Monroe and the others, gentlemen of their era, were sobered. They assured him that the matter was a private one. They would consider the investigation closed and would keep his confession in the strictest confidence. As they left his office, a wave of profound relief washed over Hamilton. The fire was out. The political threat had been neutralized. He had saved his life's work. The secret of his greatest personal failing was now safe, locked away in the minds of a few of his political rivals. He believed the crisis was over. He could not have been more wrong. The time bomb had been set and the fuse was now lit. The secret is buried for now, but such secrets rarely stay buried for long. We now proceed to the public explosion in Chapter 12. The Reynolds Pamphlet. Shall we continue? Chapter 12. The Reynolds Pamphlet. New York and Philadelphia, 1797. 5 years had passed. Alexander Hamilton had retired from the Treasury in 1795, returning to his law practice in New York to finally build the fortune his family deserved. Though out of office, he remained the intellectual and strategic heart of the Federalist Party, a private citizen with more public influence than most sitting senators. He was an elder statesman at 42, his counsel still sought by President Washington and his cabinet. The sordid affair with Maria Reynolds was a ghost, a shameful memory locked in a vault of the past, the secret, he believed, safely kept. But political secrets, like bodies, have a way of resurfacing. The serpent was a man named James Callender, a scurrilous journalist and political pamphleteer whose pen was a hatchet for hire. He had been a weapon for Jefferson's party for years, and he had come into possession of the documents from Hamilton's secret confession, likely leaked by someone in James Monroe's circle who saw no reason to keep honoring a gentleman's agreement with a political enemy. In the summer of 1797, Callender published a pamphlet titled The History of the United States for 1796. Buried within its pages was a bombshell, the explicit accusation that Alexander Hamilton, while Secretary of the Treasury, had been involved in illegal speculation with James Reynolds and had used government funds to cover it up. The adultery, Callender alleged, was just an elaborate story Hamilton had concocted to hide his far greater crime of plundering the public trust. The accusation, once a whispered rumor, was now a public firestorm. The pamphlet spread through the country like a plague, reprinted in every Republican newspaper. Hamilton's enemies were jubilant. This was it, The final, fatal blow that would not just wound the man but obliterate his reputation, and by extension, the entire Federalist ideology he had built. Hamilton's friends and allies were aghast. They urged him to do the only sensible thing: ignore it. Callender was a known liar, a gutter journalist. To respond would be to dignify the slander. The story would fade, they insisted. Let the mud dry and it will brush off. But they did not understand the core of Alexander Hamilton's being. He had built his entire life, from the moment he stepped off the boat from St. Croix, on the foundation of his intellect and his honor. His financial system, his vision for America, his entire legacy, it was all predicated on his unimpeachable public integrity. To be called a fool was an annoyance. To be called a monarchist was a political disagreement. But to be called a thief was an existential threat. It negated everything he was and everything he had built. He could not let it stand. Eliza, who knew nothing of the affair, pleaded with him to let it go. "There is no truth in it," she said, her faith in him absolute. "Your character will defend itself." He looked at his wife, the anchor of his life, the mother of his children, a woman of profound grace and unwavering loyalty. He knew what he was about to do would shatter her world. It would be a public humiliation of the cruelest kind. The choice before him was stark: his wife's peace or his public honor. In the great, tragic miscalculation of his life, he chose honor. He decided he would not simply deny the charge. He would annihilate it with the absolute, unvarnished, and brutal truth. He would control the narrative. He locked himself in his study. For weeks, he did little else but write. He gathered the old, sordid evidence: Maria's cloying, misspelled letters, his own notes to her, the blackmail demands from her husband. He would prove with meticulous, irrefutable detail that the money he paid James Reynolds was his own, the price of his silence in a tawdry affair, not the spoils of a corrupt bargain with public funds. The result was a 95-page document that would become one of the most shocking and bizarre publications in American political history: Observations on Certain Documents, commonly called the History of the United States for 1796, known to history simply as the Reynolds pamphlet. He published it at his own expense in the late summer of 1797. The nation was stunned. No one had ever seen a public figure do anything like it. It was a political suicide note written as a legal brief. With cold, lawyerly precision, he laid out the entire affair, from the first knock on his door to the final blackmail payment. He included transcripts of the most intimate and embarrassing letters. "The charge against me is a fabrication," he wrote in the pamphlet's introduction. "I can prove it, but to do so, I must reveal a story of private failing that I have long wished to conceal. My real crime is an amorous connection with his wife." He detailed the trysts, the lies, the web of deceit. The pamphlet was a confession of staggering candor, a deliberate act of self-immolation to save one part of his reputation by incinerating the other. The political effect was catastrophic. His enemies were delighted beyond their wildest dreams. They hadn't needed to prove their case. Hamilton had done it for them, and in far more lurid detail than they could have invented. His own party, the Federalists, were horrified. Their great leader, the brilliant symbol of their party, had revealed himself to be a common adulterer. His moral authority was shattered. His future prospects of ever holding the presidency, once a near certainty, were gone forever. But the true devastation was not political, it was personal. He had sent a copy to Eliza just before its publication. The discovery of his betrayal and the knowledge that the entire world would now know of it broke her. The quiet, steady foundation of their lives was dynamited. When a pregnant Eliza went into labor shortly thereafter, the trauma was so great that she suffered a miscarriage. He had won his point. No honest person could now believe he was guilty of financial corruption. He had successfully defended the honor of the Treasury Secretary, but he had done so at the cost of the husband and the father. He had saved his public ledger by setting fire to his own home. He stood in the wreckage, his integrity as a statesman secure, his personal life a smoldering ruin. This act of self-destruction will have devastating consequences, not just for Hamilton but for his children. The next chapter deals with the gravest of them all. We proceed to chapter 13, The Father's Grief. Shall we continue? Chapter 13, The Father's Grief. New York City, 1801. The wounds of the Reynolds pamphlet never truly healed. They scarred over, leaving a permanent sensitivity in the Hamilton family. The political world remained a viper's nest, and Alexander Hamilton, though a private citizen, was still the chief target of Republican scorn. His children, now growing into adulthood, had to navigate a world where their father was both a revered founder and a reviled monarchist. None felt this burden more acutely than his eldest son, Philip. Philip, at 19, was the mirror of his father. He was handsome, charming, and possessed a brilliant, combustible intellect. He had just graduated with honors from Columbia College and was beginning to study law. He adored his father, saw him as a giant among men, and was fiercely, almost recklessly, protective of his legacy. He had inherited Alexander's pride and his quick temper, but not yet his father's hard-won experience in tempering them. On a Friday evening in November, Philip and a friend, Richard Price, attended a play. In a nearby box sat George Eaker, a prominent Republican lawyer known for his loyalty to Jefferson and his public disdain for Hamilton. During the intermission, Philip and Price overheard Eaker loudly denigrating their hero, repeating the old, tired slanders against the former Treasury Secretary. Philip's blood ran hot. He saw it as his duty, his honor-bound obligation to confront the man. He and Price went to Eaker's box. Words were exchanged, sharp, biting, and fueled by political animosity and youthful pride. Eaker, feeling cornered by the two young men, responded with a volley of insults, calling them rascals. In the rigid, honor-obsessed culture of the New York elite, it was a word that could not be ignored. A challenge was implied, and a duel was now almost inevitable. Philip went home and confessed everything to his father. Alexander felt a cold dread grip him, a feeling far worse than any he had known on the battlefield. He saw his own reflection in his son's predicament, his own life of conflict, his own participation in the code of honor, now visited upon the person he loved most in the world. The abstract had become horrifyingly concrete. He was trapped by the very code he had lived by. To tell Philip to refuse the duel would be to brand his son a coward for life, a fate Alexander considered a form of living death. Yet the thought of his son facing a loaded pistol was an unbearable agony. He sat Philip down in his study, the same room where he had written the pamphlet that had cast such a long shadow over their lives. He gave his son the advice he thought was the only honorable path, the same path he himself had often resolved to take. Philip must accept the challenge. He must go to the dueling ground, but once there he must throw away his shot. He was to raise his pistol to the sky and fire into the air, an act known as a delope. It was a gesture of supreme gentlemanly courage, satisfying the demands of honor without succumbing to the barbarism of bloodshed. Surely, he reasoned, Eaker would then do the same, and both men could walk away with their honor intact. The duel was set for a Sunday afternoon in Weehawken, New Jersey, a secluded spot on the Hudson Palisades, whose isolation made it a popular, if illegal, location for settling affairs of honor. Philip was rowed across the Hudson, the late autumn air sharp and cold. He was calm, resolved to follow his father's instructions to the letter. He stood opposite Eaker, the gray river behind him, the leafless trees like skeletal fingers against the sky. The seconds conferred, the pistols were loaded, and the men took their positions. At the command, both men raised their arms. Philip, true to his father's word, pointed his pistol to the sky. He held his fire, waiting, giving Eaker the chance to do the same. Eaker did not wait. He took careful aim and fired. The ball tore through Philip's right side, ripping through his hip and lodging in his back. A searing, white-hot pain exploded through him. He collapsed to the ground, his own pistol discharging uselessly as he fell. His honor was satisfied. His life was bleeding out onto the cold New Jersey dirt. A messenger was dispatched to the Hamilton home in Manhattan. Alexander received the news with a strangled cry of disbelief. He and a frantic Eliza rushed to the home of her sister, Angelica, where their dying son had been taken. They found him laid out on a bed, his face pale with shock, his breathing shallow. The doctors could do nothing. The wound was mortal. All that was left was the long, agonizing vigil. For the next 24 hours, Alexander and Eliza did not leave his side. The father who had commanded armies and built nations was now utterly powerless, reduced to a spectator of his son's final, brutal agony. He held Philip's hand, wiped the sweat from his brow, and listened to his delirious moans. He saw in his son's tormented face the horrific cost of his own combative life. The vicious political battles, the pamphlets, the public feuds, they had all seemed like necessary struggles for the soul of a nation. Now he saw them for what they were, a legacy of conflict that had led his brilliant, beloved son to this bloody end. Eliza, her heart already broken by her husband's public betrayal, now endured a mother's ultimate nightmare. She prayed, she wept, she clung to her son, her grief a silent, fathomless ocean. Philip died the next morning in his parents' arms. The city, which had so often been the stage for Hamilton's triumphs, was plunged into mourning. But for Alexander, the world had simply ended. The light in his life had been extinguished. He was a changed man, a hollowed-out shell of the brilliant, energetic force he had once been. The fire of his ambition was gone, replaced by the cold ashes of grief. He renounced the code of honor that had claimed his son, speaking out against the barbarism of dueling. The man who had lived by the pen and the sword now saw only the blood on their tips. He had lost his firstborn, the mirror of his soul, to a bullet that felt as if it had been aimed at him all along. The tragedy of Philip's death sets the stage for Hamilton's own final confrontation. We now move to the last chapter of his life, chapter 14, the last full measure. Shall we proceed? Chapter 14, the last full measure. New York and New Jersey, 1804. Grief had hollowed Alexander Hamilton out, but it had not removed him from the world. The political arena, the source of so much of his pain, still demanded his attention. And in that arena, one rival more than any other had come to personify everything he distrusted: Aaron Burr. The animosity between the two men was a long, slow-burning fire. They were the dark mirrors of each other, both brilliant lawyers, both ambitious former officers, both New York political titans. But where Hamilton was driven by an almost fanatical devotion to his political principles and the nation he had built, Burr seemed driven by nothing but a bottomless, unprincipled ambition for personal power. Hamilton saw Burr as a man of immense talent but no core beliefs, a dangerous and untrustworthy chameleon who would say anything or align with anyone to advance his own cause. Twice, Hamilton had placed himself directly in the path of Burr's ambition. In the presidential election of 1800, a quirk in the Electoral College resulted in a tie between Thomas Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr. The election was thrown to the House of Representatives. Many of Hamilton's Federalists, loathing Jefferson, planned to throw their support to Burr. Hamilton, in a series of urgent letters, intervened. He told his party that while he disagreed with Jefferson on nearly everything, Jefferson was a man of principle. Burr, he warned, was an embryo Caesar, a man without principle who would bleed the nation for his own gain. Hamilton's influence was decisive, and the presidency went to his arch-nemesis, Jefferson, making Burr a frustrated and sidelined vice president. The final collision came in 1804. Burr, his national political career in shambles, ran for governor of New York, hoping to rebuild his power base. Hamilton once again moved to block him, viewing the prospect of Burr controlling his home state as an existential threat. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring Burr's defeat. During the campaign, a private letter containing Hamilton's opinions was published, in which he was quoted as calling Burr a dangerous man, and expressing a still more despicable opinion of him. For Burr, this was the last straw. His career was in ruins, his name was sullied, and he blamed one man, Alexander Hamilton. He seized upon the word despicable. It was an insult that could not be ignored. He sent a letter to Hamilton, demanding an immediate and unqualified apology and retraction. Hamilton was trapped. The code of honor he had come to despise after his son's death now held him in its inescapable grip. He could not apologize for an opinion he genuinely held, and any attempt to explain or qualify his words, to engage in the nuanced parsing of language that was his specialty, was seen by Burr as a cowardly evasion. After a tense and fruitless exchange of letters, the inevitable occurred. Aaron Burr challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel. A storm of conflict raged within Hamilton. His religious faith, renewed and deepened by the tragedy of his son, told him that dueling was a mortal sin. His heart, still broken, recoiled at the thought of inflicting such pain on his beloved Eliza and his remaining 7 children. He had seen firsthand the savage futility of this ritual. Yet his sense of duty to his country told him he could not refuse. The nation was fragile. The Jefferson administration was, in his view, dangerously weak. He believed a future crisis with France or Britain was inevitable, and that in such a moment his leadership might be called upon to save the Republic. If he were to decline the duel, he would be branded a coward. His public reputation would be destroyed, his political influence would evaporate, and his ability to lead would be gone forever. He made his decision. He would accept the challenge. But like his son, he would not fire at his opponent. He would go to the dueling ground, face Burr's pistol, and throw away his shot. It was a compromise born of a tortured conscience, an attempt to satisfy the world's demand for honor while remaining true to his own moral convictions. In the days leading up to the duel, he put his affairs in order with a grim, methodical calm. He worked on his legal cases, spent precious time with his family, and on the final night sat at his desk to write. He wrote a letter to the public, explaining his reasons for accepting the duel. And then he wrote to Eliza. "My dearest, darling wife," the letter began, the quill poised over words he knew would break her heart. "The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted. Adieu, best of wives and best of women." The morning of July 11, 1804, dawned clear and calm. Hamilton rose before the sun, met his second, and was rowed across the Hudson River. The water was still, reflecting the pink and orange of the coming dawn. He looked back at the sleeping city, the place where he had found his voice, built his career, and forged a nation. They landed at Weehawken. It was the exact same patch of ground where Philip had fallen 3 years earlier. The air was heavy with ghosts. He stood opposite Burr. He saw no hatred in the man's eyes, only a cold, impassive resolve. The seconds offered the pistols. Hamilton, according to some accounts, put on his spectacles, as if to aim, a final piece of theater for the sake of the honor code. The command was given. 2 shots rang out, almost simultaneously, echoing across the river. Burr stood unscathed. Hamilton felt a cataclysmic impact, a white-hot explosion of pain in his right side. The ball had struck him in the abdomen, fracturing a rib, tearing through his liver and diaphragm, and lodging in his spine. His pistol, likely discharged involuntarily from the shock, fired harmlessly into the trees above. He clutched his side and crumpled to the ground. "I am a dead man," he gasped as his surgeon rushed to his side. He was carried back across the river, his life ebbing away with every agonizing breath. He was taken to the home of a friend in Greenwich Village. Eliza was summoned. She arrived to find her husband dying, his face a pallid mask of pain. The scene was a grotesque echo of the vigil she had kept at their son's bedside. For 31 hours he lingered, surrounded by his weeping family and friends. He spoke his last words to his wife and children, bidding them farewell. On the afternoon of July 12, 1804, Alexander Hamilton, the bastard orphan of the Caribbean, the hurricane who had willed a nation into being, was dead at the age of 49. Epilogue. Who tells your story? The news of his death sparked a wave of national grief and outrage. Aaron Burr, the sitting vice president, was now a fugitive, wanted for murder. The man who had fired the shot was politically and socially ruined, his name forever linked with infamy. But the final victory belonged to Eliza. She would outlive her husband by 50 years. She would outlive Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all his great rivals. In the years after his death, as his enemies rose to power, they attempted to write him out of the story, to paint him as a monarchist, an elitist, a footnote to the Jeffersonian ideal. Eliza would not allow it. With a quiet, unyielding determination, she dedicated the rest of her long life to preserving her husband's legacy. She organized his tens of thousands of pages of writing. She fought to have his biography published. She raised funds for the Washington Monument. She wore a small locket with a lock of his hair around her neck until the day she died. She made sure that the story of the brilliant, flawed, and indispensable immigrant who had helped build her country would not be forgotten. She told his story.